The first time that morning, people stopped looking at him as a case number and started looking at him as a person. The judge's expression hardened. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Marcus's mother sat frozen in the gallery, her hands clasped together as though she were holding onto the last thread of hope she had left. Whatever happened next would determine whether her son walked out of that courtroom with a future or became another young man swallowed by a system that had already made up its mind. To understand how Marcus Reed ended up standing in that courtroom, you have to go back long before the burglary charge, long before the fingerprints, and long before his name appeared in police reports and newspaper headlines. At 18 years old, Marcus was the kind of young man most communities claim they want more of. He wasn't perfect, but he worked harder than most people his age ever had to. He grew up in a modest neighborhood on the edge of town where opportunities seemed scarce and success often felt distant. After his father died unexpectedly from a heart attack when Marcus was 12 years old, the responsibility of holding the family together fell entirely on his mother, Denise Reed. Denise worked as a nurse at County General Hospital. Most weeks, she worked far beyond her scheduled hours. Double shifts became normal. Weekends disappeared. Holidays often meant another day at work. The sacrifices took a toll on her physically and emotionally, but she rarely complained. Every extra shift represented another utility bill paid on time, another grocery trip completed, another chance to keep Marcus focused on school instead of worrying about the financial pressures weighing heavily on their household. Some nights, she would leave before sunrise and return long after dark. Marcus understood exactly why she did it. He saw the overdue notices arrive in the mailbox. He heard conversations about rent payments. He noticed when his mother skipped buying things for herself because there wasn't enough money left after paying household expenses. Instead of becoming bitter, Marcus developed a determination that impressed nearly everyone who knew him. Teachers described him as respectful and disciplined. Classmates remembered him as quiet but dependable. He excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science. While many students viewed those subjects as difficult obstacles, Marcus saw them as opportunities. He became fascinated with engineering and spent countless hours reading about bridges, transportation systems, and emerging technologies. By his senior year, his hard work had paid off. He had earned acceptance into a respected engineering program, something that represented far more than a college admission letter. To Marcus, it was proof that the struggles his family endured might finally lead somewhere better. His schedule was exhausting. He attended school during the day and worked part-time afterward at a local grocery store. The job wasn't glamorous. Most of his time was spent stocking shelves, cleaning aisles, and unloading deliveries. Yet he never complained. Every paycheck helped his family. Every shift moved him one step closer to his goals. After work, he often returned home and studied late into the night. There were evenings when the lights in his bedroom remained on until well past midnight, while he worked through advanced mathematics problems or prepared applications for scholarships. His future depended on opportunities he knew would not simply be handed to him. Neighbors respected him because he consistently showed up when people needed help. He mowed lawns for elderly residents without charging them. He carried groceries for those who struggled with mobility. During winter storms, he helped clear driveways before leaving for school. These weren't actions performed for recognition. Most people never knew about them until much later. Marcus simply believed that if someone needed help and he was capable of helping, he should. Yet despite everything he had accomplished, there was one chapter of his life that never completely disappeared. For years earlier, during one of the hardest periods his family had ever faced, 14-year-old Marcus made a decision he would regret for years. His mother had fallen behind financially. The refrigerator contained very little food. Pride prevented her from asking for assistance. Marcus saw the stress on her face every day and felt powerless to fix it. One afternoon, he walked into a convenience store and slipped bread and peanut butter into his backpack. He was caught before he reached the parking lot. The consequences were immediate. Police were called. Marcus was detained. His mother was devastated. The court eventually treated the incident as a juvenile offense. Marcus accepted responsibility, completed community service requirements, and worked hard to earn back trust. The case was sealed. Legally, it was supposed to remain in the past. For years afterward, he used the experience as motivation to become a better person. Every achievement he earned seemed to place more distance between him and that mistake. Unfortunately, some mistakes never disappear as completely as people hope. When detectives began investigating the burglary at Eleanor Whitmore's home, they searched extensively for potential suspects. During that process, Marcus's juvenile record surfaced. Suddenly, a mistake committed by a hungry 14-year-old became part of a much larger narrative. Investigators who knew nothing about the circumstances began viewing him through a different lens. The hardworking student disappeared. The aspiring engineer disappeared. The devoted son disappeared. What remained was a prior record attached to a new criminal investigation. For many people following the case, the contradiction was difficult to understand. How could someone with Marcus's reputation become the primary suspect in a burglary? How could a young man accepted into an engineering program risk everything for stolen jewelry and cash? Why would someone who spent years rebuilding his future suddenly throw it away? Those questions lingered in the minds of anyone willing to look beyond the headlines. Then investigators made a discovery that changed everything. Inside Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom, among the evidence collected from the crime scene, forensic technicians identified fingerprints. Not just any fingerprints. The fingerprints belonged to Marcus Reed. And in that single moment, every assumption about the case became far more complicated. The discovery of Marcus Reed's fingerprints inside Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom changed the direction of the investigation almost overnight. What had begun as a search for possible suspects suddenly became a focused effort to build a case against one young man. Detectives believed they finally had the breakthrough they needed. Prosecutors saw a clear path toward conviction. Reporters who had been following the story now had a compelling headline. To most observers, the mystery appeared to be solved. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more questions began to emerge. To understand why the fingerprint evidence carried so much weight, it's important to understand who Eleanor Whitmore was and why her case attracted so much attention throughout the community. At 71 years old, Eleanor was one of the most respected residents in the county. For more than 3 decades, she had worked as a teacher, helping generations of students pass through her classroom. Former students often described her as patient, dedicated, and deeply invested in their success. Even after retirement, she remained active in local events and volunteer programs. Many people knew her by name. Others simply referred to her as Mrs. Whitmore, the teacher who always seemed willing to help. She lived alone in a quiet neighborhood where serious crimes were rare. Her home sat on a peaceful street lined with well-kept lawns and mature trees. Neighbors watched out for one another. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Most residents considered it the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked during the day. That sense of security shattered on the afternoon of May 8th. According to investigators, Eleanor had left her home for several hours. When she returned, something immediately felt wrong. At first, she couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Then she noticed drawers partially opened inside her bedroom. Jewelry boxes had been disturbed. Personal belongings were scattered in places she knew she had not left them. As she continued searching the house, the extent of the theft became clear. Several pieces of valuable jewelry were missing. Family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations had vanished. Cash that Eleanor kept secured inside her home was gone. Even her laptop computer had disappeared. The financial loss was significant, but for Eleanor, the emotional impact ran much deeper. Many of the stolen items carried decades of memories. Some had belonged to family members who were no longer alive. Replacing them would be impossible. The crime itself raised immediate concerns among investigators. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No damaged doors. Nothing suggesting that someone had violently forced their way inside. Whoever entered the home either knew how to avoid attracting attention or had found another way inside. That detail immediately caught the attention of detectives. Experienced investigators understood that burglaries without forced entry often pointed towards someone familiar with the property or someone who had access that others did not. As forensic teams processed the scene, they carefully examined every room. Photographs were taken. Surfaces were dusted. Potential evidence was collected and cataloged. For days, investigators worked through the material gathered from the home. Then came the discovery that seemed to tie everything together. Marcus Reed's fingerprints were identified among the evidence collected inside Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom. For detectives, it was exactly the kind of evidence they had hoped to find. Fingerprints were tangible. They appeared objective. Unlike witness testimony, Fingerprints couldn't forget details or change stories. Unlike rumors, fingerprints seemed factual. Combined with Marcus's juvenile record, investigators believed they had enough information to move aggressively. The more they examined Marcus's background, the more convinced some detectives became. They discovered the shoplifting incident from when he was 14 years old. Even though the offense involved food and had occurred years earlier, it now became a central part of the narrative forming around him. To certain investigators, it suggested a pattern. To prosecutors, it provided context they believed a jury would find persuasive. There was only one problem. Marcus did not fit the image many people expected. His teachers defended his character. Employers described him as reliable. Neighbors struggled to believe he would commit such a crime. Yet those voices were quickly drowned out by something far more powerful: public opinion. Local media coverage intensified after Marcus's arrest. Headlines emphasized the fingerprint evidence. Television segments focused on the burglary. Social media discussions exploded with speculation. Within days, many people had already reached their own conclusions. Some viewed the case as open and shut. Others argued that fingerprints inside a victim's bedroom left little room for doubt. Neighbors who barely knew Marcus began assuming the worst. Strangers discussed his guilt as though a verdict had already been delivered. Every new article seemed to reinforce the same message. The evidence pointed toward Marcus Reed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere reflected that growing belief. The prosecutor appeared increasingly confident. The judge showed little sympathy. Even some individuals selected for jury consideration seemed influenced by the publicity surrounding the case. Before opening statements had even begun, Marcus faced an uphill battle. Yet beneath the surface, investigators were encountering details that refused to fit neatly into their theory. One detective reviewing the evidence noticed inconsistencies within the timeline. Another questioned whether certain assumptions had been accepted too quickly. Small details that initially seemed unimportant began attracting closer attention. Individually, none of them appeared significant. Together, they created a problem. The more detectives reviewed the crime scene photographs, the more one particular question continued to surface. If Marcus Reed had committed the burglary exactly as prosecutors claimed, why did certain pieces of evidence appear out of place? At first, nobody paid much attention to those concerns. After all, fingerprints inside the victim's bedroom seemed difficult to explain away. Yet experienced investigators know that evidence should tell a coherent story. Every detail should support the same sequence of events. In this case, one crucial detail refused to cooperate. Weeks after the arrest, a closer examination of the forensic reports revealed something startling. The fingerprints discovered inside Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom shouldn't have been where they were found. And once investigators understood why, the entire case began to change. The revelation sent a ripple through the investigation. For weeks, detectives had treated the fingerprint evidence as the strongest piece of proof against Marcus Reed. Prosecutors viewed it as the foundation of their entire case. Reporters repeated it in every story. The public accepted it as fact. Yet a closer examination of the forensic reports suggested something that should have been impossible. The fingerprints found inside Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom appeared far newer than investigators initially believed. That single detail raised a troubling question. If Marcus insisted he had never entered Eleanor's home during the burglary, how had his fingerprints ended up in a location that seemed so important to the crime? Among the investigators assigned to review the growing evidence file was a young detective named Daniel Harper. Unlike many of the senior officers involved in the case, Harper had not participated in the original arrest. He approached the evidence without the same assumptions that had shaped the early stages of the investigation. While reviewing hundreds of pages of reports, photographs, and witness statements, he became increasingly focused on one issue that nobody else seemed eager to discuss: the timeline. Every criminal investigation depends on a timeline. Detectives must determine where people were, when events occurred, and how each piece of evidence fits together. If even one important detail falls outside that sequence, an entire theory can begin to collapse. As Harper reviewed the reports, he noticed several inconsistencies that made him uncomfortable. According to prosecutors, Marcus Reed entered Eleanor Whitmore's home, stole jewelry, cash, and a laptop computer, then left without attracting attention. The theory sounded straightforward enough. However, when Harper compared witness accounts with the estimated time of the burglary, certain details failed to align. Some statements suggested activity near the home at times prosecutors had largely ignored. Other reports contained observations that never appeared in official summaries. The more he examined the evidence, the more questions emerged. Harper requested access to security footage collected from businesses and residences located near Eleanor Whitmore's neighborhood. Much of the material had already been reviewed, but he wanted to start from the beginning. Hour after hour, he watched recordings from traffic cameras, convenience stores, parking lots, and residential security systems. Most of the footage appeared routine. Cars passed by. Pedestrians walked along sidewalks. Nothing seemed remarkable. Then he shifted his attention toward witness statements. Many witnesses reported seeing nothing unusual on the day of the burglary. Others offered vague observations that investigators considered unreliable. Yet one statement caught Harper's attention. The witness had described seeing an unfamiliar individual near Eleanor Whitmore's property during the time investigators believed the crime occurred. The description wasn't detailed enough to identify anyone, but it was specific enough to raise concerns. Strangely, that lead had gone nowhere. The witness had never been asked for a second interview. No follow-up questions appeared in the case file. No effort seemed to have been made to verify the observation. For Harper, that omission made little sense. At the same time, investigators began reviewing cell phone records connected to the case. Prosecutors believed the data supported their theory, but the records created additional uncertainty. Marcus's phone activity placed him in locations that complicated portions of the official timeline. While the information didn't immediately prove his innocence, it certainly didn't strengthen the prosecution's narrative as much as many had claimed. The deeper Harper looked, the more convinced he became that critical information had been overlooked. One evening, while reviewing witness files for the third time, he returned to the statement from the individual who reported seeing someone near Eleanor Whitmore's home. This time, he noticed something else. The witness hadn't simply described an unfamiliar person. They had also mentioned a vehicle parked farther down the street. The detail occupied only a few lines in the report, buried beneath paragraphs investigators seemed far more interested in. Yet Harper couldn't understand why such information had been dismissed. Who was that person? Why had investigators moved on so quickly? And why did nobody appear interested in finding answers? As those questions lingered, Harper arranged to meet the witness personally. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but it changed the direction of the investigation. The witness remained confident in what they remembered. They recalled seeing someone near Eleanor Whitmore's property who didn't appear to belong there. More importantly, they were surprised nobody had ever contacted them again. They had expected follow-up interviews. They had expected detectives to ask additional questions. Instead, weeks passed without a single phone call. Harper left the meeting frustrated. If the witness was telling the truth, investigators had ignored potentially important information during the earliest stages of the case. Back at the office, he continued searching through archived evidence. Security footage, dispatch logs, interview transcripts, digital records. He examined everything he could find. What began as curiosity gradually transformed into suspicion. Somewhere inside the evidence file, there seemed to be a missing piece. Something wasn't adding up. Then came the discovery that would push the investigation into entirely new territory. While reviewing records connected to neighborhood surveillance systems, Harper noticed a reference to a video file that appeared in an evidence inventory but could not be located anywhere else in the case materials. At first, he assumed it had been misplaced. Administrative errors happen in nearly every large investigation. But after checking multiple databases, he realized the file wasn't merely missing. It had been deleted. The surveillance recording had existed. It had been logged. And then it had disappeared. The question was no longer whether important evidence had been overlooked.